He'd been destroying Allied tanks for 3 years. His Panther could punch through any American armor from a mile away. Then he saw what happened when 5 Shermans surrounded him. What he learned that day made him tell his captors that Germany had already lost. August 1944, northern France. A veteran German panzer commander named Otto Karius has just been captured after his tank was disabled by American forces. He's been interrogating captured American tankers for months, learning about their equipment. He thinks he understands American tanks. The Sherman is inferior, lightly armored, weak gun, easy to destroy. But when American interrogators start asking him questions, and he sees American weapons up close for the first time, everything he thought he knew gets turned upside down. This is the story of what German prisoners discovered about American weapons that changed how they saw the entire war. Throughout World War II, German soldiers were taught that their equipment was superior to anything the Allies had. German tanks like the Tiger and Panther were portrayed as unstoppable. German rifles and machine guns were described as the finest in the world. German artillery was supposedly the most accurate and deadly. This wasn't just propaganda. In many cases, it was true. German equipment often had better specifications than equivalent Allied equipment. The Tiger tank had armor that could withstand most Allied tank guns. Its 88 cannon could destroy any Allied tank from ranges where Allied tanks couldn't even fight back. The Panther had excellent armor, good mobility, and a powerful gun. The MG-42 machine gun fired so fast that Allied soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw. German military technology was genuinely advanced in many areas. But German soldiers didn't understand the full picture. They knew their equipment was good. What they didn't know was that the Allied approach to weapons was fundamentally different. Germans built weapons that were individually superior, but complex and expensive to produce. Allies, especially Americans, built weapons that were good enough and could be mass-produced in enormous quantities. This difference in philosophy meant that a Tiger tank was better than a Sherman tank in a one-on-one fight. But America built 50 Shermans for every Tiger Germany built. Numbers mattered more than individual quality. German soldiers learned this lesson the hard way on the battlefield, but German prisoners learned it in a different way when they encountered American weapons and production up close. The story of German POW reactions to American weapons starts with expectations shaped by German propaganda and battlefield experience. German soldiers knew American equipment existed. They'd fought against it, but they understood American weapons through a German lens. They saw American equipment as inferior because individual pieces were less sophisticated than German equivalents. A Sherman tank had thinner armor than a Panther. Its main gun was less powerful. In tank versus tank combat, the Panther usually won. German tank crews knew this from experience. They destroyed numerous Shermans in battle, so they concluded that American tanks were inferior. What they didn't see was the factory in Detroit producing Shermans at a rate that German factories couldn't match. What they didn't understand was that America's advantage wasn't in individual tank quality, but in tank quantity. When German soldiers were captured and interrogated, American intelligence officers would ask about German equipment and tactics, but they'd also show German prisoners American equipment. This was partly to gather intelligence about what Germans knew and how they'd react, but it was also psychological warfare. Showing German prisoners the scale and quality of American production was meant to demoralize them and convince them that Germany couldn't win. The reactions German prisoners had to American weapons fell into several categories. Some prisoners dismissed American equipment as inferior because it didn't match German specifications. Others were shocked by the quantity and the realization of what it meant. A few understood immediately that Germany was facing an opponent whose industrial capacity made victory impossible regardless of individual weapon quality. One of the first shocks many German prisoners experienced was seeing American supply operations. German logistics by 1944 were a mess: fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, spare parts impossible to get. German soldiers were used to fighting with inadequate supplies. They'd scavenge from destroyed vehicles. They'd ration ammunition carefully. Every shell and bullet was precious because replacements weren't guaranteed. American supply operations were nothing like this. German prisoners being transported to POW camps would see American supply convoys, trucks as far as the eye could see, all moving supplies forward, fuel trucks, ammunition trucks, food trucks, spare parts, replacements for everything. The scale was staggering compared to what German logistics looked like in 1944. Some German prisoners initially thought these supply convoys were for show, that Americans were moving empty trucks around to create an impression of abundance, but prisoners who were put to work in supply operations discovered the trucks weren't empty. American supply dumps held enormous stockpiles, mountains of ammunition, fuel by the thousands of gallons, spare parts for every vehicle, food for weeks or months. The abundance wasn't an illusion, it was real. This realization was shocking. If Americans could supply their forces with this level of abundance, what did that say about American industrial capacity? German industry was being bombed day and night. Factories were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Production was falling. Meanwhile, America was producing so much that they could afford to stockpile vast quantities of supplies in forward areas. The first American weapon that shocked many German prisoners was the M1 Garand rifle. German soldiers carried the Kar-98K, a bolt-action rifle. It was accurate and reliable, but it was bolt-action, meaning the soldier had to manually work the bolt to chamber a new round after each shot. This limited the rate of fire. 5 shots, then reload with a stripper clip of 5 more rounds. The design was from the 1890s. American infantry carried the M1 Garand, semi-automatic, gas-operated, 8-round internal magazine. Pull the trigger, the rifle fires, automatically chambers the next round, ready to fire again. No manual bolt operation, faster rate of fire. The soldier could keep their sights on target between shots instead of working a bolt. The Garand was a significant technological advance over bolt-action rifles. German prisoners who saw the Garand up close were often impressed despite themselves. Some immediately recognized that this gave American infantry a firepower advantage. An American soldier with a Garand could fire 8 aimed shots as fast as they could pull the trigger. A German soldier with a Kar-98K could fire maybe 2 or 3 aimed shots in the same time, and those required working the bolt between shots. But some German prisoners dismissed the Garand. They'd say it was less accurate than the Kar-98K, that semi-automatic meant less precise shooting, that the Kar-98K was more reliable. These were rationalizations. The truth was that the Garand was a better infantry rifle for modern warfare. But accepting that meant admitting American weapons weren't all inferior, which challenged the narrative German soldiers had been fed. The M1 Garand represented something important: American willingness to equip infantry with modern technology at scale. Germany had semi-automatic rifles in development, but never produced them in large numbers. Too expensive, too complex. Germany stuck with the Kar-98K because they could produce it in quantity with existing factories. America tooled up to produce millions of Garands because they understood that better equipment for infantry was worth the investment. German prisoners who understood this implication realized that America was thinking about warfare differently than Germany. Germany optimized for what they could produce with available resources. America optimized for what would be most effective and then mobilized resources to produce it. This difference in approach explained a lot about why Germany was losing. The next shock for many German prisoners was American artillery. German artillery was excellent. The 88mm gun was legendary, accurate, powerful, effective against tanks and aircraft. German artillery officers were well trained. German artillery tactics were sophisticated. German prisoners were proud of their artillery. But American artillery operated on a different scale. The sheer number of guns was shocking. American divisions had far more artillery tubes than equivalent German divisions, more ammunition, better fire control systems, and most importantly, better coordination between forward observers and firing batteries. German prisoners learned about American artillery coordination through interrogations and observation. American forward observers could call for artillery support and have shells landing on target within minutes. The communication systems that made this possible were far superior to German equivalents. American radios were more reliable. American fire control procedures were more efficient. American artillery could mass fires from multiple batteries on a single target with devastating effect. Some German prisoners had experienced American artillery barrages. They described them with a kind of awe. The intensity, the accuracy, the responsiveness. If American infantry called for artillery support, it arrived fast and in overwhelming quantity. German artillery support was often delayed or unavailable because of ammunition shortages or broken communication lines. American artillery support was nearly always available and arrived in crushing volumes. The psychological impact of American artillery was significant. German prisoners would talk about how American artillery affected morale. Knowing that Americans could drop that much explosive on your position at any time was terrifying. German soldiers learned to dig deep and hope they survived. Many didn't. But the weapon that shocked German prisoners most consistently was the Sherman tank, not because it was individually impressive. As German tank crews correctly noted, the Sherman was inferior to German late-war tanks in armor and firepower. A Panther or Tiger could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't penetrate German armor. This was true. What shocked German prisoners was how many Shermans there were and how Americans used them. German tank doctrine emphasized individual tank duels. German crews were trained for precision gunnery at long range. German tactics involved finding good positions and destroying enemy tanks from distance. This played to German tanks' advantages in armor and gun power. American tank doctrine was different. Americans understood that Shermans couldn't win head-on fights against Panthers or Tigers, so they didn't fight head-on. American tactics emphasized maneuver and overwhelming numbers. If a Panther appeared, American doctrine was to avoid frontal engagement. Maneuver to the flanks or rear where Panther armor was weaker. Use multiple tanks to attack from different directions simultaneously. German prisoners captured by American armored units would hear stories from their captors about tank battles. Americans weren't stupid. They knew their tanks were outgunned, so they fought smart. 5 Shermans would engage 1 Panther. The Panther might destroy 1 or 2 Shermans, but while the Panther was engaging those targets, the other Shermans were maneuvering to hit the Panther's weaker side or rear armor. Numbers and tactics overcame individual tank superiority. This was infuriating to German tank crews who prided themselves on their equipment and skill. They'd win individual engagements but lose battles because Americans kept coming with more tanks. Destroy 5 Shermans and 10 more would appear. The mathematics of attrition favored whoever could build and field more tanks. America could, Germany couldn't. German prisoners who understood this industrial reality had a moment of realization. Germany couldn't win a war of attrition against an enemy who could outproduce them 10-1. Quality didn't matter if the quantity gap was too large. Some German tank commanders admitted in interrogations that they'd known by 1944 that Germany was going to lose. They just didn't say it out loud because defeatism was punished severely in the German military. The M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun was another weapon that impressed German prisoners. Germany had excellent machine guns. The MG-42 was probably the best squad automatic weapon of the war, but the Browning .50 cal was something different. It was heavy, it was mounted on vehicles or in fixed positions, but it had incredible range and hitting power. German prisoners would see .50 cal machine guns mounted on American vehicles, jeeps, trucks, tanks, anti-aircraft positions, everywhere. The Americans loved this weapon and used it constantly. German aircraft learned to fear the .50 cal. Allied air superiority meant German planes rarely operated in contested airspace, but when they did, concentrated .50 cal fire from ground positions was deadly. The .50 cal could also be used against light vehicles and infantry positions at long range. German prisoners described taking fire from .50 cals at ranges where they couldn't effectively return fire with their own weapons. The psychological impact of being hit by .50 cal rounds was significant. The bullets were big and devastating. A hit from a .50 cal round could take off limbs or tear through cover that would stop rifle rounds. What impressed German prisoners about the .50 cal wasn't just the weapon itself, but how ubiquitously it was deployed. Americans mounted them on everything. Supply trucks had .50 cals for air defense. Tanks had them as secondary weapons. Infantry positions had them for long-range fire support. The sheer number of .50 cal machine guns in American units was staggering compared to anything Germany fielded. This pattern of American weapons deployment revealed something important. America wasn't trying to build a few perfect weapons. They were building large numbers of good weapons and distributing them widely. Every American combat unit had access to serious firepower. German units had to make do with what was available, which by 1944 was often inadequate. The moment when many German prisoners' understanding completely shifted came when they visited or learned about American factories. Some prisoners were put to work in American war production plants. This was allowed under the Geneva Conventions as long as the work wasn't directly military. German prisoners worked in factories making non-military goods or components that weren't finished weapons. But even in these factories, German prisoners could see American industrial capacity up close. The scale of American factories was shocking. German factories were smaller and more specialized. American factories were massive operations with assembly lines that produced thousands of items per day. The efficiency was remarkable. The automation was beyond what German industry had achieved. German prisoners who'd worked in German factories before the war could make direct comparisons. American factories were cleaner, better lit, better organized, more mechanized. Workers were more productive because they had better tools and better working conditions. The output per worker was significantly higher in American factories than in German factories. This observation led to uncomfortable realizations. If American civilian factories were this advanced, what must American military factories be like? German prisoners knew that American military production was enormous. They'd faced the results on the battlefield, but seeing the industrial capability that made that production possible was different. It made the numbers real. Some German prisoners were shown propaganda films about American war production. These films were meant to demoralize prisoners by showing them the vast scale of American industry. Images of B-24 bombers rolling off assembly lines at rates of 1 per hour, tanks being produced by the hundreds per week, ships being built in days instead of months using prefabrication techniques. German prisoners' reactions to these films varied. Some insisted the films were faked or exaggerated, that Americans were lying about their production numbers. Others recognized the films were probably accurate based on what they'd experienced and observed. These prisoners understood that Germany was fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity was multiple times larger than Germany's. One German officer, a tank commander who'd been captured in France, described a moment of clarity during interrogation. The American intelligence officer asked him how many tanks he thought Germany was producing per month. The German officer estimated based on what he knew, maybe 500 tanks per month across all types. The American officer said that was approximately correct. Then he told the German officer that America was producing over 2,000 tanks per month. Just America, not counting British or Soviet production. The German officer initially thought this was a lie. It seemed impossible, but then he did the math. He destroyed dozens of American tanks in combat, but there were always more. No matter how many German tank crews destroyed, American tank units kept coming back at full strength. If America was really producing 2,000 tanks per month, that explained everything. Germany couldn't destroy them faster than America built them. This realization was crushing. The German officer admitted in his interrogation report that he understood at that moment that Germany had no chance of winning. The war was lost. It was just a matter of time. Individual German superiority in training or equipment quality didn't matter when the numbers were so lopsided. America could afford to lose 4 tanks for every German tank destroyed and still come out ahead. Germany couldn't. Another shocking discovery for German prisoners was American logistics equipment. Not weapons exactly, but the trucks, jeeps, and transport systems that made American military operations possible. German military logistics relied heavily on horses. Yes, Germany had trucks and vehicles, but the German army of 1944 still used hundreds of thousands of horses to move supplies and artillery. American military logistics was completely mechanized. Trucks everywhere, jeeps for reconnaissance and command vehicles, specialized vehicles for every purpose, tank transporters, mobile repair shops, everything moved by motor vehicle. The efficiency advantage was enormous. Mechanized logistics could move supplies faster over longer distances with fewer personnel than horse-drawn logistics. German prisoners seeing American motor pools for the first time were often stunned by the number of vehicles. Row after row of trucks, all maintained, all fueled, all ready to move supplies. Compare this to German logistics where vehicles were constantly breaking down and couldn't be repaired because spare parts weren't available. American vehicles broke down too, but there were so many spares and replacement parts that broken vehicles could be repaired or replaced quickly. The contrast extended to small arms ammunition. American soldiers seemed to have unlimited ammunition. They could fire their weapons freely without worrying about running out. German soldiers, by 1944, were often rationing ammunition, told to fire only when they had clear targets, conserve every bullet because resupply was uncertain. German prisoners would hear stories from their captors about American soldiers firing at anything suspicious, suppressive fire, reconnaissance by fire, tactics that relied on having abundant ammunition. German prisoners were shocked by what seemed like wastefulness, but it wasn't waste, it was abundance. America could afford to give soldiers enough ammunition that they didn't have to ration. This gave American infantry a significant tactical advantage. The story of German POW reactions to American weapons reveals fundamental truths about World War II and about warfare in general. First, individual weapon quality matters less than many people think. German weapons were often superior in specifications to American weapons, but America won because they produced more weapons and supported them with better logistics. Second, industrial capacity is the foundation of modern military power. Germany had advanced technology and skilled soldiers, but German industry couldn't match American production. This gap was decisive. No amount of tactical brilliance or individual courage could overcome the fact that America could build weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. Third, how soldiers understand their situation affects morale and effectiveness. German soldiers who believed their equipment was superior fought confidently even when losing battles. German prisoners who discovered the truth about American industrial capacity often became demoralized. This wasn't weakness, it was realism. Understanding that the war was unwinnable affected how prisoners thought about Germany's future and whether Nazi ideology made sense anymore. The reactions German prisoners had to American weapons also reveal how propaganda shapes perception. German soldiers were taught that their equipment was the best in the world and that Allied equipment was inferior. This was partly true in terms of individual weapon specifications, but it was completely false in terms of overall military capability. Quality doesn't win wars. The combination of adequate quality and overwhelming quantity wins wars. German prisoners who understood this distinction often went through a psychological shift. They'd believed Germany was superior. Battlefield experience showed that Americans were tough opponents, but German prisoners could rationalize that as Americans having numerical advantages. But when prisoners saw American production capacity and logistics systems up close, they understood that the numerical advantage wasn't temporary or local. It was systemic and insurmountable. This understanding affected how German prisoners viewed their own service and Germany's future. Some prisoners became bitter. They'd fought and sacrificed for a cause that was doomed from the start. Their suffering had been pointless because Germany couldn't win against an enemy with such vast industrial superiority. Other prisoners became reflective. Maybe Germany should never have started the war. Maybe the leadership had been criminally irresponsible to challenge enemies with such overwhelming economic advantages. For American intelligence officers, showing German prisoners American weapons and production capacity served multiple purposes. It gathered intelligence about what Germans knew and how they thought. It demoralized prisoners by making them understand the war was lost. And it prepared prisoners for post-war Germany by breaking down their belief in German superiority and Nazi ideology. The effectiveness of this approach varied. Some German prisoners, especially young soldiers who'd been conscripted, were receptive to evidence that Germany had been wrong and couldn't win. These prisoners often participated in denazification programs and prepared to return to Germany as democratic citizens. Other prisoners, especially career military officers and committed Nazis, rejected evidence that contradicted their beliefs. They insisted American production numbers were lies, that German equipment was still superior, that Germany would still win somehow. But the majority of German prisoners fell somewhere in between. They weren't ideological fanatics, but they also weren't ready to completely abandon their beliefs immediately. Gradually, as they spent time in American POW camps and saw more evidence of American capabilities, many came to accept that Germany had lost and that American systems were more effective than German systems. The weapons themselves weren't the point. The Sherman tank, the M1 Garand, the .50 caliber machine gun, American artillery, these were tools. What mattered was the system that produced these tools in enormous quantities, distributed them effectively, and supported them with logistics that kept soldiers supplied. German prisoners learned that modern warfare isn't won by having the best individual weapons. It's won by having good enough weapons in sufficient quantities, supported by excellent logistics, and maintained by a powerful industrial base. This lesson wasn't just relevant to World War II. It applies to all modern conflicts. Nations with strong industrial bases and good logistics can sustain military operations that nations without these advantages cannot match. Individual weapon quality matters, but it's not decisive if your opponent can field 10 times as many slightly inferior weapons. Understanding this reality shaped how German prisoners viewed the war and how military planners in all nations thought about warfare after World War II ended. The German prisoners who recognized these truths early were the ones who adapted most successfully to post-war life. They understood that Germany needed to rebuild based on different principles, not military conquest and ideology, but economic development and integration with former enemies. The Marshall Plan and German economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s were built partly by Germans who'd learned from their defeat that productive capacity and efficient systems matter more than military adventures. For the prisoners who never accepted these lessons, post-war life was harder. They clung to beliefs that the war had been lost through betrayal or bad luck, not through systemic German disadvantages. These prisoners often struggled to adapt to democratic West Germany. Some remained bitter about the war for the rest of their lives. The story of German prisoners discovering American weapons and production capacity is ultimately a story about how evidence can change minds, but not always easily or completely. Seeing American weapons and factories forced many German prisoners to confront uncomfortable truths about the war and about Germany. Some accepted these truths and changed their understanding. Others rejected evidence that contradicted their beliefs. Most fell somewhere in the middle, gradually accepting some truths while holding onto some old beliefs. But the overall pattern was clear. German prisoners who spent time in American captivity, who saw American weapons and logistics and production capacity up close, generally came away with a different understanding of the war than they'd had as fighting soldiers. They understood that Germany hadn't lost because German soldiers weren't brave or because German equipment was bad. Germany lost because the industrial and economic disparity was too large to overcome through battlefield courage or tactical skill.